It's good to be back again today. We are talking about one of the most popular Christian writers in the 20th century, C.S. Lewis. And there's a lot of reasons he's popular, but probably one of the most important ones is that he had so many different kinds of literature that he wrote. And this created a number of different on-ramps for lots of different kinds of people. He wrote philosophy and theology and apologetics and science fiction and fantasy and children's literature and poetry and literary theory and aesthetic history and Christian allegory and spiritual autobiography and fictional letters and even devotional meditations. So with Lewis, there's something for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're old or you're young, you can find something you like. And that's one of the reasons why he was such a popular writer. But he's probably best known for defending what's called mere Christianity. He was a very important apologist, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that coming up. But Lewis wrote for the common man, and so that's why he has become so well known and loved. Last week we looked at Lewis the man, and on one level, Lewis wasn't that interesting as a man, if you think about it. I mean, on one level, he didn't take a lot of adventures traveling across the globe with a lot of neat selfies of himself in all kinds of interesting places. He spent most of his life in Oxford, and even when he was a professor in Cambridge, he would always go home to Oxford. So in a certain sense, Lewis's life wasn't that interesting. But on another level, he lived a profound life. It was a life that movies have been made of, which is a good reminder to all of us that you can live a very profound and rich and meaningful life, even in a place that may not, it might be remote, like Sierra Madre, where we're today. But Lewis really lived a profound life because he lived an examined life. He was living during a time when Freud was important, and people were paying a lot of attention to what was going on in their own lives, underneath, within their internal lives. Lewis lived a profound life because he had rich friendships with Arthur Greeves and Patty Moore and the Inklings. And he also lived a profound life because he was asking the big questions in life as an apologist. He was working between the intersection of reason and imagination, philosophy and English. He was the head of both the Oxford Socratic Club and the Defender of the Imagination. And so these are some of the things that made Lewis such an interesting writer, such an interesting man. So last week we looked at Lewis the man, and then today we're going to look at Lewis the theologian. Lewis the theologian. And there's many ways in which I think Lewis, many reasons why Lewis would shy away from wanting to be known as a theologian. The reality is that Lewis didn't like to be known as a theologian. But Lewis actually had read quite a bit of theology. He actually read more theology than the average layperson. He's aware of the patristics. And in fact, when Lewis actually coins the term mere Christianity, he gets it from one of our own, because we are Congregationalists, that means Puritans, from Richard Baxter, who is a Puritan from the 17th century. Richard Baxter writes, "You know what? You know not of what party I am or what to call me. I will tell you, I am a Christian, a mere Christian. I'm of that party that is so against parties, if the name Christian is not enough, call me a Catholic Christian." And so Catholic, of course, used to mean just universal. If you were to ask Augustine what he is, he wouldn't say he's a mere Christian. He would say he's a Catholic Christian. But the idea behind Lewis's coining the term mere Christian or Catholic Christian is the idea that there's something that all Christians have believed throughout history, a certain common core of essentials. And Lewis wanted to focus in on that. Lewis also shied away from being known as a theologian because Lewis was not trained in theology. He knew his limitations. Lewis writes, "The questions which divide Christians from one another often involve points of high theology. I should have been out of my depths in such waters." So Lewis wants to write about mere Christianity because he doesn't want to get into the details of theology because he's not a theologian. And we must remember that Lewis is an academic. He's at Oxford. Oxford is a place where there are academic theologians who specialize in going into the details. And Lewis knew as an academic that he needed to stay within the boundaries of his field. If you are an astrophysicist, you don't start acting like you're a biologist. The biologist will say, "What are you doing? This is your field." Well, Lewis didn't want to act like a theologian. But I think there's another reason why Lewis shied away from being called or known as a theologian. And the reality is Lewis was an evangelist at heart. He desires to reach people who are not Christians rather than debate fine points with those who are. Lewis writes, "I have thought that the best service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times." So Lewis shied away from the title of theologian, but this doesn't mean that Lewis felt that theology was not necessary. Lewis recognized that it was inevitable that everybody has thoughts about God, be they Christians or Muslims or agnostics or atheists. And therefore, we want to be as clear as we can about what those thoughts are. If you are an atheist, you have a thought about God, namely that God doesn't exist. Or if you're an agnostic, you have thoughts about God, namely that God is the kind of being that we cannot know whether or not that God exists or does not exist, and so on and so on. So Lewis knew that people would inevitably have thoughts about God. Everybody you meet is a theologian. The question is not if they're going to be a theologian. The question is whether or not they're going to be any good as a theologian. But Lewis writes, "Theology is practical, for if you do not listen to theology, that will not mean that you have no ideas about God. It will mean that you have a lot of wrong ones. For a great many of the ideas about God, which are trotted out as novelties today, are simply the ones which real theologians tried centuries ago and rejected." Now, Lewis has a really wonderful metaphor of what theology is like. It's like a map. Lewis views theology like a map. He says, you can meet somebody who spends a day at the beach, and they have a certain experience of the sea. And that's a person that might be interesting to talk to. In fact, it might be really preferable to spend a day at the sea than to spend a day reading a map. But Lewis says, if you're going to sail a boat, what you need is not to sit there and have somebody there next to you who spent a day at the beach telling you how to get from A to B, from, New England down to North Carolina. What you need is a map. You need a map. And so Lewis sees theology as something that is like a map. Lewis writes, "Theology is like a map. You will not get anywhere by looking at maps without going to sea. Nor will you be very safe if you go to sea without a map." Now, this is what I like about what Lewis is saying. Lewis is saying it's not enough to have a map if you want to call yourself a sailor. If you want to call yourself a sailor, you're going to need to sail. But at the same time, if you're going to sail, you're going to need to learn how to read a map. And Lewis is saying it's not enough to learn all kinds of theology. You need to start by prayer. That at the very core, if you're going to be a theologian, the very first step is actually to spend some time with the experience of God. You need to start with prayer. Theologians start off as people who have a rich prayer life, and then they go and they consult the map. They consult Scripture. They consult what Christians have said for centuries about who God is based on Scripture. And that helps them to adjust their experience with what's real, and they can get from A to B. Now, Lewis, as a theologian, does have a characteristic way about him. Lewis uses argument, he uses humor, he uses prose, but his theology is marked especially by the use of images and metaphors. It's often a smuggled theology. Sometimes you'll be reading maybe the Chronicles of Narnia, and you're reading about this lion, Aslan, and suddenly you think, wait, this sounds an awful lot like Jesus. You know, you're reading, and suddenly you're in Paralandra, and you think, wait, this sounds an awful lot like heaven. So Lewis smuggles in his theology. Lewis uses profound images like a map. Theology is like a map. He uses metaphors. And this is because Lewis is, I think, one of the greatest theologians when it comes to being able to offer people imaginary theological traction. And Lewis is just a genius at that. Let's talk a little bit about Lewis and the Bible. You know, Lewis respected creeds and he read theologians. If you read Lewis as a theologian, you'll immediately identify that Lewis has lots of different theological sources. He's reading the patristics. He's reading some of the theologians from the Middle Ages and whatnot. Lewis clearly understands the creeds. And Lewis is reading the Bible. And it's really important if you're going to do theology, of course, to understand the Bible, because the Bible is fundamental for doing Christian theology. It's the primary source. It's the final authority when it comes to Christian theology. And Lewis has the same posture. This lay woman wrote Lewis and said, hey, I've talked to 3 different lay people about the virgin birth. And this 3 different clergymen. And this clergyman said this about the virgin birth. And this clergyman said this about the virgin birth. And this clergyman said this about the virgin birth. So which is right? And Lewis's response is, don't worry about what these clergymen say. Go back and read the Bible. You need to start there. That's the primary source. Lewis writes, it is quite right to go away from the words of the Bible for a moment in order to make some special point clear, but you must always go back. Naturally, God knows how to describe himself much better than we know how to describe him. So Lewis had this desire to keep Scripture as fundamental, and I think this is a mark of a good theologian, is they recognize at the end of the day, all we really have is what God has expressed about himself. Now, one of the things I also like about Lewis is Lewis rejected both liberal and fundamentalist interpretations of the Bible. Lewis avoided both pitfalls. What are those pitfalls? Well, the liberal pitfall is the idea that the Bible is disconnected from history. Rudolf Bultmann said, it doesn't matter whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. What matters is that he rises in our hearts. Well, the Apostle Paul said, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, this is all hogwash. Let's pack our bags and go home, right? So Paul apparently thought the historicity of the resurrection was important in spite of what Rudolf Bultmann said. So on one hand, you have the liberal threat to the Bible, which says that there is no historical connection here. It's just myth that floats above history. On the other hand, you have fundamentalists that want to say that the Bible should be just taken simply literally. And that sounds like a very pious thing to say until you realize that the Bible itself uses all kinds of symbolism. It uses all kinds of different genres. And so in order to avoid both of these pitfalls, this is what evangelicals do. Evangelicals take the Bible on its own terms. You read the Bible on its own terms. And this is what Lewis did. Lewis writes, we must both assent to the historical fact and also receive the myth, fact though it has become, with the same imaginative embrace which we accord all myths. Now, Lewis was an expert in myth, and myth is, for Lewis, something he studied, he knew a lot about. And a myth is a powerful story that captures the social imagination of a people. And if you remember from last week, Lewis's entire conversion was where he realized that not only was the story of Christ, as recorded in the Gospels, myth in the sense that it had this powerful way of capturing you, but it was at the same time a myth that actually happened. And so that was Lewis's aha moment, which also is the way in which he understands how to avoid both the liberal and the fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible. All right, let's get into Lewis's theology proper. Lewis's theology proper. And we're going to start with Lewis on the Trinity. For Lewis, the Trinity is central. Lewis gives us his theology for the non-theologian and non-Christian in Book 4 of Mere Christianity. And in this Book 4, we see him talking about the Trinity. But because Mere Christianity is going to play such an important role in this class, let's go ahead and quickly review what takes place in Mere Christianity. As we said last week, Mere Christianity was written during World War II. Lewis was invited by the BBC to give a series of talks. At first, he thought it was only going to be 5 talks. And then there was such an outcry, he was invited back, and then invited back, and then invited back. And when everything was said and done, he had actually given 4 different sets of talks. And then these became compiled into 3 books, and then they were put together back into one book, Mere Christianity, which had those 4 sets of talks. So there's 4 actual sections in Mere Christianity. The first one is right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. And this first one is really apologetics, and we're going to get into this when we talk about Lewis the apologist. And then the next major section is what Christians believe. And this is where Lewis doesn't get into theology per se as much as into defending theism, the idea that God and the universe are not the same, that God created the universe as compared to other worldviews. The third major book deals with Christian ethics. We're going to look at this next week, and this is a book section in Mere Christianity called Christian Behavior. And then finally, in the fourth section of Mere Christianity, it's where Lewis gives us his theology. It's called Beyond Personality, Our First Steps in the Doctrine of the Trinity. And it's in this final book, this final section of Mere Christianity, that Lewis talks about God and man. And he calls it Beyond Personality. And it's a really interesting title. I'm not sure that Lewis is entirely happy with the title himself because he gives us 2 titles, right? But why does he call it Beyond Personality? Well, he calls it Beyond Personality for 2 reasons. Number one, in terms of God, he wants to talk about a 3-person God as being infinitely personal in a way that moves beyond human persons. So it's a 3-person God. That's beyond just simply one person, one personality for one thing. But then he also likes the title Beyond Personality because he wants to talk about humanity being designed to go beyond the personalities given by nature to be elevated while in relationship with this 3-person God. So what this tells us is that Lewis is going to show the relationship between God's 3-personed nature and human persons as designed to participate in the 3-personed God. And Lewis begins this talk on the nature of God with what has been called the problem of the lonely God. The problem of the lonely God. Lewis is going to say that mere theism, the idea that there is a supernatural, ultimately powerful and beneficent and omnipotent being, and then there's creation, is not enough. It's not enough. Lewis writes, people are fond of repeating the Christian statement that God is love. But the words God is love have no real meaning unless God contains at least 2 persons. Love is something that one person has for another person. If God was a single person, then before the world was made, he was not love. Christians believe that the living, dynamic activity of love has been going on in God forever and has created everything else. So what do we mean when we say God is love? You know, oftentimes people like to say God is love, and they think like, oh, that means God is, gummy bears and rainbows and the movie Titanic and Sunday on a Sunday ice cream, and all wrapped together. And that's God is love. God's everything I like. Well, that's not what the Bible is saying when it says God is love. When the Bible says God is love, it's saying something about the nature of God. That God himself always is moving towards another in love. But then this creates the problem of the lonely God. Because look at this. How can God be love unless there's some object in which God is loving? But if God needs an object in order to be God, then God is not God. God's not sovereign. So the only way you can really have a God of love is if God has within God's self 3 persons, or at least 2 persons, one which is loving the other person within the Godhead. And in fact, it can even be argued that there's something different about the love between one to another and the love of 2 to a third. And so Lewis starts off with this powerful account of the problem of the lonely God in order to move us into the Trinity. And if you're interested in that problem, there's actually a lot of work done on that by a philosopher named Richard Swinburne at Oxford. But what's really interesting is Lewis starts off by talking about the nature of God. And Lewis says this: perhaps this is the most important difference between Christianity and all other religions. In Christianity, God is not a static thing, not even a person, but a dynamic, pulsating activity, a life, almost a kind of drama, almost, if you will not think me irreverent, a kind of dance. Now, this is really interesting. Lewis here makes this claim that the triune nature of God really is a way of talking about God as dance. Lewis speaks of the Trinity as a kind of dance. And Lewis here is drawing from an ancient tradition that we find in Maximus the Confessor and Gregory of Nyssa and John of Damascus. And it is this word, perikoresos. Perikoresos, which actually translates as rotation, or the Latin is circumsession. And Maximus the Confessor and Gregory of Nyssa and John of Damascus and some of these early patristics talked about the triune nature of God as perikoresis. But when they spoke of God as perikoresis, they meant that within the persons of the Trinity, there's always this interaction, this dynamic interaction. But Lewis here takes up this ancient tradition of perikoresis, and he describes it not as a dynamic interaction of giving and receiving, but as actually a kind of dance. And Paul Fittis, who is he's a theologian at Oxford, a Baptist theologian at Oxford, has pointed out, and he's right, that no one before Lewis had ever thought of perikoresis as dance. So this is a very unique contribution that C.S. Lewis has given to Christian theology. Even though Lewis is not an academic theologian, this was picked up by a lot of academic theologians, Jürgen Moltmann and Miroslav Volf, and John Zizoulis and Wolfhard Pannenberg and Hans Urs von Balthasar and a bunch of other European theologians picked up on this and have picked up on this. So this is a really unique contribution that Lewis gave us, and it's become quite a focus that God, in a certain sense, is within the triune nature of God. We see this kind of dance. And in fact, at the end of Paralandra, Ransom has a vision of the great dance where, quote, love and splendor flow forth like a strong river, making new channels. All which is not itself the great dance was made in order that he might come down into it. And so Lewis here even pulls in this. And of course, Lewis here is probably pulling from Maximus the Confessor's celestial hierarchy and maybe something of Dante's circles that are spinning out in the Paradiso. But Lewis is moving it away from this idea of rotation again into the idea of a great dance. It's a profound thought that God is dance and that we are invited into the dance, which is God's continual giving and receiving of joyful love. But Lewis, I think, actually stumbled upon this idea of dance because he wants to emphasize that it's not enough to know about the Trinity. The whole point is to be invited into the life of the Trinity. It's about participating. It's about experiencing. Dance is not a concept to digest, but an action to engage in. Again, as Lewis said about the map, it's not enough to read a map. Maps are good, they're important, but you need to sail. The whole point of a map is the idea that you're going to be sailing, and the whole point of God's triune nature is not to simply try to conceptualize it, but to enter into that continual loving friendship of the Trinity. As Lewis writes, on the human level, one person is one being, and any two persons are two separate beings, just as in two dimensions, one square is one figure, and any two squares are two separate figures. On the divine level, you still find personalities, but up there you find them combined in new ways, while we, who do not live on that level, cannot imagine. In God's dimension, so to speak, you find a being who is three persons while remaining one being, just as a cube is six squares while remaining one cube. Of course, we cannot fully conceive a being like that, just as if we were made in two dimensions, we could not conceive a cube. And so Lewis is saying something which theologians have always known, which is that all images of the Trinity at the end of the day break down because God exists in a realm, in a dimension, in a way, in a place completely different from us, right? We are the creation and God is the creator. So there is a gap. There is an ontological gap between us and God that we cannot cross. And so all theological language at the end of the day breaks down. All theological language is analogical. It's analogical. Pseudo-Dionysius tells us this, and Aquinas, and as Calvin said, that when we read the Bible, we think this is really complex stuff, but really from God's perspective, the Bible's just baby talk. If you have a child, you come up and you try to say things very simple, and the Bible's God saying goo goo gaga goo goo to us, and because God's trying to put it in our language. He's trying to put it in our language. And the whole point of hearing about the Trinity is not that we finally wrap our head around this great mystery that God can be both three and one, but Lewis would say the whole point is for us to know that the same kind of eternal love as Jesus prayed in his prayer, that the Father and him would be one, and that then we would enter into that same love, that we would enter into that. I think of a grandfather who's walking with his grandson. There's no way that young 4-year-old, 5-year-old could comprehend the life of this grandfather and all the things that he's been through, but he can still commune with his grandfather. He can still fellowship with his grandfather. And Lewis is saying the same thing. We will never fully wrap our head around the Trinity, but we can still enter into that communion with the triune God. Let's talk a little bit about Lewis on Jesus Christ. Lewis lines up with what the Nicene Creed from 381 says about Jesus Christ. The Creed says, "We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. And in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of the Father before all worlds, light of light, very God of very God, begotten not made, being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made, who for us men and our salvation came down from heaven and was incarnate by the Holy Ghost and of the Virgin Mary, and was made man. He was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate and suffered and was buried, and the third day he rose again according to the Scriptures and ascended into heaven and sits on the right hand of the Father. From there he shall come again with glory to judge the quick and the dead, whose kingdom shall have no end. And in the Holy Ghost, the Lord and giver of life, who proceeds from the Father, who with the Father and the Son together is worshipped and glorified, who spoke by the prophets. And we believe in one holy Catholic Church. We acknowledge one baptism for the remission of sins. We look forward for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come." So this is the Nicene Creed. It's a creed that has been embraced by Christians for centuries. And again, it lines up with Lewis's aim at presenting mere Christianity. I want to focus right now on the second article of the creed. Of course, the third article gets very interesting, and we always want to talk about, well, in what sense is he talking about the Catholic Church and the Apostolic Church? And I think as a Protestant, I can embrace that, and that's a whole other conversation for another talk. But right now, I want to focus in on this big section here, the second article of the Creed, which is really about Christ. And Lewis here holds to what Christians have always held to regarding Jesus Christ. Lewis writes, "In the New Testament, the Son is identified with the discourse or reason or word which was eternally with God, and he also was God. He is the all-pervasive principle of concretion or cohesion whereby the universe holds together. All things, and specifically life, arose within him, and within him all things will reach their conclusion, their final statement of what they have been trying to express." You can actually hear Lewis borrowing some of the language from the Creed. And here again, more explicitly, the second person in God, the Son, who knows everything and who created the whole universe, became not only a man, but before that, a baby. And before that, a fetus inside a woman's body. If you want to get the hang of it, think of how you would like to become a slug or a crab. I love that. Think of how you'd like to become a slug or a crab. Or again, and now we see Lewis getting very explicit. The Creed says Christ is begotten, not created. When you beget something of the same kind as yourself. A man begets human babies, but when you make something of a different kind from yourself. A man makes a statue. It may look like a man, but of course, it's not a real man. What God begets is God. What God creates is not God. Just as what man makes is not man. That is why men are not sons of God in the sense that Christ is. They may be like God in certain ways, but they are not the things of the same kind. They are more like statues or pictures of God. So these three quotes I just gave you in succession, if you pay attention, you can actually hear Lewis developing the language of the Creed and putting it in our common vernacular. So all this is to say that Lewis held a very, very traditional, orthodox, mere Christian view of who Jesus Christ is, the only begotten Son of God, as the Creed states. Let's move on to Lewis on salvation. Lewis on salvation. Lewis draws a lot of different pictures into his discussion of what it looks like to get into God, getting into God, as Lewis might say. And he starts off by talking about humanity's natural condition apart from knowing Christ. And Lewis states something which Christians have always believed, that apart from knowing Christ, all we have is a distorted, self-centered imitation of real life. See, Christians have always believed that we come into this world naturally self-centered. We come into this world naturally distorted. And Lewis states that humans are made in the image of God, but we are currently like these lifeless statues. We have the shadow appearance of what we were really made for, that we become infected with something that has marred our nature. And we were made to be living, beautiful creatures filled with glory and beauty, but something has happened. And because of this, we no longer have the kind of spiritual life we were meant to have. Lewis writes, the natural life in each of us is something self-centered, something that wants to be petted and admired, to take advantage of other lives, to exploit the whole universe. And especially it wants to be left to itself, to keep well away from anything better or stronger or higher than it, anything that might make it feel small. It is afraid of the light and the air of the spiritual world, just as people who have been brought up to be dirty are afraid of a bath. And in a sense, it is quite right. It knows that if the spiritual life gets a hold of it, all its self-centeredness and self-will are going to be killed, and it is ready to fight tooth and nail to avoid that. So Lewis believes in the doctrine of original sin. What is that? It's the doctrine that people are born into this condition called sin, in this condition of distortion, without the kind of spiritual life that they need, and that they must be, as Jesus told Nicodemus, born again from above. Because we're connected with that original Adam rather than Christ, we don't have the life we need. Lewis writes, if you could see humanity spread out in time as God sees it, it would not look like a lot of separate things dotted about. It would look like one single growing thing, rather like a very complicated tree. Every individual would appear connected with every other. Now, you might say, well, yeah, I've always believed this. I'm a Christian. I've always believed that we're born connected to Adam's sin and that we have a sinful nature. But you have to understand that that when you study theology, there's a lot of people that want to pull these ideas apart, that want to rip out what seems to be a pretty clear teaching of the Bible. But Lewis had this great way of showing how these traditional doctrines actually make a lot of sense. And so Lewis goes on from there, and he gives, again, lots of different images of how we get out of this condition. Lewis talks about it being like joining into the dance of the Trinity, as we already said. It's like entering into the eternal love of the triune God. Lewis writes, you may ask, if we cannot imagine a three-personal being, what is the good of talking about him? Well, there isn't any good talking about him. The thing that matters is actually being drawn into that three-personal life. And that may begin any time tonight, if you like. The whole dance or drama or pattern of this three-person life is to be played out in each one of us. Each one of us has got to enter that pattern, take his place in that dance. There is no other way to happiness for which we were made. So for Lewis, one image he brings of salvation is, as we've said, it's like joining the dance. But another image he gives is it's like catching a good infection. Lewis says, how do you get warm? Well, you go stand by a fire. And how do you get wet? You jump in a lake. Well, how do you get into a whole new kind of life? How do you go from your present condition to one that is filled with joy and power and peace and eternal life? Well, you need to get close to the source of those things, which is God's self, the energy source of all life, spurting from the very center of reality from God. That is what you need to do. But then Lewis says this, how can we possibly get close to that source? Well, the good news is that source came to us. This is what Christ came to do. Christ came to bring us the power, the joy. Christ invaded our world. This is one of Lewis's favorite themes. Remember, Lewis is writing during World War II, right? He's giving these talks here in World War II where invasion is, we're ready for D-Day. We're on the verge of invasion, right? And so Lewis uses this analogy of invasion where we think about the dark, area that is controlled by the Axis powers. And we're going to have to invade. Well, Christ came to invade our earth, our sin-sick world, in order to bring us life because we were enslaved and controlled and oppressed. Lewis writes, we have not got Zoe, our spiritual life, only bios, our biological life, which is presently going to run down and die. He means Christ, came to this world and became a man in order to spread to other men the kind of life he has, what I call good infection. We've not got to try to climb up into spiritual life by our own efforts. It has already come down into the human race. If we will only lay ourselves open to the one man in whom it was fully present, and who, in spite of being God, is also a real man, he will do it in us and for us. Remember what I said about good infection. One of our race has this new life. If we get close to him, we shall catch it from him. I love this. One of our own race has this new life. If we get close to him, we shall catch it from him. So Lewis is telling us that we need to get close to Jesus. That if you want to escape the condition that you were born into, which we are all naturally self-centered, and move into an entirely new kind of life, that's why Christ came. He came to give us this new kind of life. You know, Lewis is being inspired now by Athanasius' De Incarnatione, on the Incarnation, because he actually wrote the introduction to Athanasius' De Incarnatione right at the same time when he was writing about this fourth book here in what became the fourth section of Mere Christianity. And Athanasius explains that salvation as theosis. It's this, as he says, situation where Christ came in order to elevate us from our situation. Christ became man so that we might become like God, as Athanasius says. And so Athanasius understands Christ's whole mission is, as Hebrews 2:10 says, is to bring many sons to glory. And so Lewis says, drawing from Athanasius, Christ is like a deep-sea diver, who you think about like a deep-sea diver, think about a diver maybe standing on the beautiful shores of Catalina with the beach and the beautiful sun and the birds and the air and the breeze, and it's gorgeous. And what does that diver do? That diver strips down, and the diver dives into the water and goes down deep, 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 and it gets darker and darker and goes down to the murkiness and the muck and then finds us. We're like this rusted thing, right? And pulls us up, brings us back up out of that darkness and into the light, and then cleans us up and puts us on his mantelpiece as something to be displayed, as this showcased as a piece that has been glorified now. And so this is Athanasius. That the incarnation, which Lewis called the grand miracle, is the supreme invasion of the Creator into creation in order to lift up and bring back to glory that which has fallen. At our church, Christ Church, we actually have as our center stained glass, we have something representing the incarnation, and I love that. I know Lewis would love that because Lewis saw the incarnation not as just something that was the beginning, but really, in a certain sense, the entire project was God coming down and rescuing us and bringing us back up. And this is why Lewis thinks about our salvation in terms of us becoming glorified. Lewis writes, "He will make the feeblest and filthiest of us into a god or goddess, a dazzling, radiant, immortal creature, pulsating all through with such energy and joy and wisdom and love as we cannot now imagine, a bright, stainless mirror which reflects back to God perfectly, though of course on a smaller scale, his own boundless power and light and goodness." See, this is Lewis really developing Athanasius' De Incarnatione. This is Lewis really seeing what Athanasius said. And Lewis says, the reality is that if you were able to see yourself in the future, you are going to be, if you have been touched by the life of Jesus Christ, if you've been brought up and rescued by Christ and brought up and you're part of this project that Christ has come to bring salvation, if you're able to see what Christ is going to do to you and the glorious creature you're going to be right now, you would be tempted to worship yourself. Because Christ is going to make every single one of us who know Christ, who've been rescued by Christ, into such glorious creatures. See, Lewis writes in another place, "There are no ordinary people. You've never talked to a mere mortal. It is immortals with whom we joke, work, marry, snub, and exploit immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. It's a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are in some degree helping each other to one or other of these destinations." And I put this quote in here because I think it's going to point us towards our final subject, which is we're going to talk about Lewis on heaven and hell. But before we get there, I want to talk about one more metaphor that Lewis gives us. He not only talks about salvation as joining in the dance and salvation as catching a good infection, but finally, Lewis sees salvation as handing ourselves over to Christ in surrender. It's like laying down your arms and finally surrendering yourself because you have been an enemy. Lewis writes, Christ says, give me all. I don't want so much of your time and so much of your money and so much of your work. I want you. I've not come to torment your natural self, but to kill it. No half measures are any good. I don't want to cut off a branch here and a branch there. I want to have the whole tree down. I don't want to drill the tooth or crown it or stop it, but to have it out. Hand over the whole natural self, all the desires which you think innocent as well as the ones you think wicked, the whole outfit. I will give you a new self instead. In fact, I will give you myself. My own will shall become yours. Lewis says that the Christian life is both hard and easy. Christ, on one hand, says that if you're going to follow me, you need to take up your cross. What does that mean? Christ is saying, if you're going to follow me, it's going to be like you're going to be stripped and beaten and killed in a concentration camp. But Christ also says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So which is it? Is it going to be like taking up your cross, or is it going to be your yoke is easy and your burden is light? Well, Lewis here gives us the clue. Lewis is saying that, one example he gives, he says, it's like a boy who refuses to completely give into what it's going to take in order to be an algebra student. And so instead of really doing their homework, they're constantly fudging, they're constantly doing half measures, and what's going to happen to that kid? As the semester goes on and on, the homework's going to get harder and harder and more of a burden, and by time it comes time for the final exam, that boy is going to be sweating bullets. It is going to be terrible. His yoke will not be easy, his burden will not be light. But if you, from the very beginning, you just hand yourself over to Christ, you don't even fight it, you don't hold on little bits, there's no half measures, then something happens. Then you find that the yoke is easy and the burden is light. I had a friend who recently finished an Ironman, and he said it was fun. I mean, Ironman, this is a long, it's a big race, okay? It's an all-day race. It was fun. I thought, it's fun? What are you talking about? He said, yeah. I said, I swam the 2.4 miles, and I came out, and I was feeling great. And then I got on my bike, and I rode 112 miles, and I jumped off my bike, and I was feeling great. And then I did the marathon, and I saw people next to me falling over, and it was fun. It was easy. It was light. And I thought, what are you talking about? He said, yeah. I said, well, how did that happen? He said, I had to completely abandon my way of life. He said, but when I did, I found a new life. And I found that I could actually enter into something that was radically different. And his life was changed. Well, Christ calls us to that, to hand ourselves over. All right, before we conclude, I do want to say a few things about Lewis on heaven and hell, because Lewis has some really interesting things to say about heaven and hell. And I'm going to be drawing primarily from Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, which is really one of my favorites. If you've never read The Great Divorce, it is absolutely a kick. It's a bus ride from hell to heaven. And it's really a joy to read. So just off the bat, we need to say that Lewis believed solidly in hell. He even said at one point, if it was up to him, he would eliminate the doctrine. But Lewis knows it's in Scripture, and he knew that it was something that mere Christianity held to. And yet Lewis said that, and he also said that he never met anyone who disbelieved in hell who had a life-giving belief in heaven. I think that's interesting. This didn't mean that Lewis necessarily believed in devils and pitchforks. Lewis wrote, the New Testament plainly implies the possibility of some being finally left in the outer darkness. Whether this means horror of horror, being left to a purely mental existence, left with nothing at all but one's own envy, prurience, resentment, loneliness, and self-conceit, or whether there is still some sort of environment, something you would call a world or a reality, I would never pretend to know. And so Lewis there is talking about the fact that actually, if you look at the text where Jesus talks about hell, Jesus seems to be talking with a certain sense of metaphor, and so Christians have disagreed about that. But Lewis definitely believes that there is a real hell. But Lewis's thinking about hell actually took an interesting turn. Lewis read in Jeremy Taylor that some early theologians, Jeremy Taylor talks about this missal that was preached in Paris in the 13th century, where this preacher talked about a refrigerarium, a relief from hell. It was for Easter. The preacher actually thought that maybe God gave people a break on Easter, that they were in hell. And then actually a really early theologian, or Prudentius Aurelius Clemens, from the 4th century also brings up this idea of a refrigerarium, a relief from punishment. And so this triggered Lewis's imagination. He began thinking about this idea of the damned taking a day off. And then he wrote his brother in January 20th, 1940, "I began to suspect that the world is divided not only into happy and the unhappy, but into those who like happiness and those who, odd as it seems, really don't." And so Lewis was kind of putting these things together. And then he added to this Lewis's idea of the will. See, one of the key things that Lewis believed is that the human will is shaped with each choice that we make, such that there comes a point where you're no longer able to choose certain things. Lewis writes, "If we insist on keeping hell, we shall not see heaven. If we accept heaven, we shall not be able to retain even the smallest and most intimate souvenirs of hell." And what's he talking about? Lewis is talking about this idea that we can make certain kinds of choices, and after a while, you've made a certain choice to the point where you actually have no choice. I mean, we see this with addiction, right? And what is an addict? An addict is someone that makes a choice that eventually removes choice. Lewis writes, Lewis writes, "It is meaningless to talk of forcing a man to do freely what a man has freely made impossible for himself to do." So for Lewis, then, he develops this idea, and it's the idea that hell is not so much a punishment as a tourniquet to stop the lost soul's downward progression. There comes a time where you have to take an addict and you have to put certain kinds of restrictions on them so they don't continue to hurt others, right? Someone that has given themselves over to maybe perversion or lust or murderous rage, you have to put a tourniquet. And this is Lewis's idea of hell. And this is developed in his book, The Great Divorce. And it's called The Great Divorce because Lewis is making the point that heaven and hell will never be married. Lewis writes, "We do not live in a world where all roads meet at the center, but one where every road, after a few miles, forks into two, and each of those into two again. And at each fork, you must make a decision. And every time you do, you are choosing between heaven and hell." And then Lewis writes, "The only way to go from a path of hell to heaven is to abandon it and to backtrack." And the idea, Lewis's big insight out of this is that the doors of hell are locked from the inside. Lewis says a man can't be taken to hell or sent to hell. The only way you can get there is by your own steam. Lewis writes, "There are two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, 'Thy will be done,' and those to whom God says in the end, 'Thy will be done.' All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell." So this is a really interesting psychological insight about our own choices and the power of evil. And if you read The Great Divorce, the thing that will grip you is you can begin to see how hell is already at work even in your own life, right? So Lewis here makes this claim. Now that's an interesting claim. That the gates of hell are locked from the inside. It might be locked from the inside and the outside. Okay, I might think it's locked from the outside as well. Someone asked Lewis if they were locked from the outside, and Lewis said, "Yeah, maybe." He said, "But I know they're locked from the inside." So, but what is hell, right? What is hell really about? Well, it's really about self-centeredness. At the core, hell is a place of self-centeredness. And if you read the Great Divorce, you have all these damned ghosts, literally damned ghosts, it starts off with them standing in line, and they don't want to be near each other. Hell is a place that's spread out, according to Lewis. So hell is a place where no one wants to live near anybody else. There's no neighborliness. No one wants to be anybody's neighbor. And everyone's spread. And so now they're waiting in line for this bus to heaven, and they're nitpicky, and they're complaining, and they're griping, and they're getting on each other's nerves. And it's a terrible picture of humanity. Lewis writes, "We must picture hell as a state where everyone is perpetually concerned about his own dignity and advancement, where everyone has a grievance, and where everyone lives the deadly serious passion of envy and self-importance and resentment." And so it's a place where you see this kind of self-centeredness, the person imploding upon themselves. But it's also a place where you see this kind of self-implosion in the sense that there is this absolute obsession with themselves, right? There's nothing outside. If the Trinity is this constant giving and receiving and love and awareness of the other, And that's what heaven is going to be. Hell is going to be a place where you're absolutely focused on yourself. Lewis writes, a damned soul is nearly nothing. It is shrunk, shut up in itself. Good beats upon the damned incessantly as sound waves beat on the ears of the deaf, but they cannot receive it. Their fists are clenched, their teeth are clenched, their eyes fast shut. First, they will not, and in the end, they cannot open their hands for gifts, or their mouths for food, or their eyes to see. It's a picture of this self-implosion. And Lewis then draws also from Augustine's idea of evil as a deprivation of being. You know, the question was, if evil is a thing, did God make evil? And Augustine's answer to that is, actually, evil is not a something, it's the lack of something. It's like a hole in a t-shirt. A hole in a t-shirt is not a thing, it's the lack of something. And Lewis draws from this as a meditation in order to picture hell as the absence of being. See, if heaven is a place of glory, and what is glory? Well, glory literally means weightiness. Heaven is a weighty place. Heaven is a place of concentration. Heaven is a place of reality. Then hell is going to be a shadowy place. Hell is going to be a diffused place. Hell is an absence of being. And when you read The Great Divorce, you see these damned ghosts that are, when they get to heaven, they hate it. One little blade of grass in heaven is more concentrated and powerful than them, and so it's going through their feet, and their feet hurt, and everything is scary because they actually lack being, right? And then there's this wonderful scene where Lewis and his guide is George MacDonald as he goes up to heaven, and he's having this conversation all the time with George MacDonald as he sees these different damned ghosts, literally. Then he says, well, where did we come from? Where is hell? And then, did we come from that where did we come from? Were we from down there? And George MacDonald says, yeah, we came down from that little tiny crack. Do you mean that hell, all that infinite empty town, is down in some little crack like this? Yes, all hell is smaller than one pebble of your earthly world, but it's smaller than one atom of this world, the real world. Look at yon butterfly. If it swallowed all hell, hell would not be big enough to do it any harm or to have any taste. It seems big enough when you're in it, sir, and yet all loneliness, angers, hatreds, envies, and itchings that it contains, if rolled into one single experience and put into the scale against the least moment of joy that is felt by the least in heaven, would have no weight that could be registered at all. So hell is a place where you see a deprivation of being. Well, let's not end on a sad note, right? Let's end on a happy note. So we're going to talk about heaven. Let's end with heaven. So if hell is this place where there's a deprivation of being, like I said, heaven is a place where there's a concentration of being. Heaven is filled with glory, with weightiness. Heaven is reality itself. All that is fully real is heaven. As Lewis says, heaven's reality itself. All that is fully real is heaven, for all that can be shaken will be shaken. Only the unshakable remains. Heaven is a place of weightiness. And every time you love, according to Lewis, because God is a God of love, you are doing the most powerful thing that can happen in our universe. You are imitating the triune God of love. And that actually is the Christian vision. And if you're not a Christian, you should think about this. Christianity teaches that the most powerful thing you can do is you can love. Because when you do that, you imitate reality itself. What is reality itself? It's three persons in loving communion, the triune God. And when you echo that same love, you join with that same kind of glory, that same weightiness. And you yourself were destined for that kind of glory, to enter into the dance, as Lewis would say. So heaven is a place of not only a concentration of being, but a place of glory. As we already said, he'll make the feeblest and filthiest of us into a god or goddess, a dazzling, radiant, immortal creature, pulsating all through with such energy and joy and wisdom and love as we cannot now imagine. A bright, stainless mirror which reflects back to God perfectly his own boundless power and light and goodness. It's almost too good to be true, isn't it? You were created for that kind of love. You were created for that kind of glory. You were created to be elevated. And right now, Christ wants to infect you with life, with his life, with goodness. Christ wants to draw you into that dance. Christ wants to save you from yourself. He wants you to share in the eternal life and love of God. Lewis writes, the whole purpose for which we exist is to be thus taken into the life of God. So heaven is a place of life. It's a place of glory. It's a concentration of being. And finally, heaven is a place of joy. In heaven, we experience amazing joy, amazing joy. You know, joy is the kind of thing where the more you have it, the more you want it more, and it's such a pleasure. It's something that just draws you in, and that's the picture of heaven. The closest we have is romantic love. When you fall in love, what happens? You want to be with the person you love. And when you're with them, you want to be with them more and more and more. It's just not like you ever get enough, and there's so much pleasure in being with them. It's a pleasure that makes you want more, and even in the having of more, you want it more, but it's so pleasurable. That's a picture of what joy is like. That's a picture of what heaven's going to be like. It's going to be eternally entering into deeper and deeper levels of joy as we fellowship with the triune God. Lewis writes, "We shall eat of the tree of life, the faint, far-off results of those energies which God's creative rapture implanted in matter when he made the worlds, or what we now call physical pleasures. And even thus filtered, they are too much for our present management. What would it be to taste at the fountainhead that stream of which even those lower reaches prove so intoxicating? Yet that, I believe, is what lies before us. The whole man is to drink joy from the fountain of joy." You know, Lewis would say that when we look at what everybody around us is running after the pleasures that we have in this world, sex, you know, the pleasure of having power through money and all this stuff. Lewis would say, yeah, there are pleasures in this world, but they're just simply pleasures that have been seriously just filtered. They're just little tiny shadows of the kind of great joy and pleasure that awaits us in heaven. And Christ came down as a deep sea diver in order to pull us up and invite us into that life in the triune God, a life in which we enter into the giving and receiving of love, which has been happening forever in the Trinity. Thank you.